This is ProPix Canada Media. You're listening to James Kuzno coming to you from Vancouver, British Columbia. Today we're going to explore a topic that comes from California and one that I'm familiar with, and I'll explain that as we go through this podcast today. We're going to talk about the three strikes law that was brought in 1994 to the state of California and since then has been expanded to other states as well. Now, the three strikes you're out law, as it was known at the time, was brought in by Governor Wilson in 1994 when he signed it into law. And then the public reaffirmed it in November of 1994 by approving Proposition 184. Now, essentially what this was is a law that any offender who was being convicted on a third strike of violent crime, robbery with a weapon, and other aggravating circumstances, or as they're known in California, enhancements such as gang affiliations and so forth. Now, that would take their sentence, for example, someone of a robbery going for 6 years, automatically being sentenced to life in prison and taking away any hope of rehabilitation or a future outside of the walls of that prison. Now, this resulted in, prior to the law being signed in, they had a 90% plea bargain rate in the California courts. And afterwards, when we look at the strikes law, only 14% of second strike offenders accepted plea bargains. And that dropped even further to only 6% of offenders accepting plea bargains after for third strikes. So, of course, this increases investigation and prosecution costs, not to mention other related expenses that come into that. The intent was noble in trying to get a hold of the amazing numbers, or in ridiculous numbers, of crimes when it came to drive-by shootings, murders, and other violent offenses in the state. It was out of hand, and there was an epidemic of murders, drive-by shootings, in addition to, of course, the crack cocaine crisis in California, as it was across the country and in many other countries as well. Now, this also led to fewer misdemeanor crime prosecutions due to the increased workload on prosecutors and the courts. So, of course, there was less intervention at lower level crimes before these criminals got to a higher level or more serious criminal involvement. Even at that point, when it came to the lower level felonies, a lot of victims actually refused to testify due to the perceived unfairness of the three strikes laws and the unbalanced level at which they'd be convicted and sentenced, as opposed to what even the victims felt was fair. On the next level, some judges refused to acknowledge prior offenses, while others converted the offenses to misdemeanors from felonies in order to make up for that, because even they felt that certain crimes were not in line with the principles or the intent of the three strikes law. Now, you also have to take a look at the fairness. Now, the government influenced crime rates in the late 80s and early 90s, as there were accusations of the CIA involvement in bringing in mass levels of drugs to help fund black operations and other clandestine operations that they were involved with. So there was accusations of the government actually contributing to the crack pandemic or epidemic. And in that, of course, increased levels of violence and murders that were brought with such a lucrative drug trade. Now, the lack of resources and supports for families in inner city communities also contributed to the high levels of crime. When you're looking at the gang life, and kids and teens were not safe to walk the streets, even going to school, they risked getting attacked by certain gangs until they joined one or the other for protection from the others. It just wasn't a good system. And when kids are looking at the gangs for protection and then seeing gangbangers and gang leaders with, wads of cash, cars, gold, pretty ladies on their arm, and so forth, while their parents worked two jobs and struggled just to pay the bills, of course, that's going to be a very interesting option for these teens, and they don't see the larger picture of the fact that by 25, 30 years old, most of those people will be either dead or incarcerated. So they, are looking at the immediate gratification, which is normal for youth. Now, as I said, there was the forced gang protection in communities. Now, in the early 90s, I actually worked in inner city Los Angeles. I was in areas right after the riots took place and saw the devastation in communities, the businesses that were destroyed, that families had spent, a life building. And so when you look at the level of violence, the racial inequalities, and then the systemic failures of law enforcement and the courts, not to mention the abuses of law enforcement, treating every youth in inner city areas as gangbangers and criminals instead of trying to differentiate, the bad apples from the good apples and encouraging the positive, they treated everyone the same, and that was through abuse, through accusations, through, just incredible degradation of their characters. Now, the punishment versus rehabilitation is a really big thing, and that is when you look at a system that's built more for revenge than to help people to be built up to be contributing and positive members of society. That seems to be where the U.S. prison system is very good, and I mean that in the worst possible way, in that they look for revenge, they look for punishment and retribution, as opposed to true rehabilitation and bringing people to a level where they are able to find gainful employment and to fit back into society and be tax-paying citizens. Now, the average cost per inmate in 2020-2021 fiscal year was approximately $106,000 US. Now, imagine if you were to release 1,000 people that are in on life sentences due to the three strikes law, whereas you were able to rehabilitate them as opposed to keep them in for life. Just 1,000 inmates would save the state budget over $1 billion a year. Yes, that's a billion with a B. Now, if you take even a portion of that and steer it into educational opportunities and treatment programs and rehabilitation that actually works within the prison system, and let's say you spend even half that amount per year, you're also reducing the recidivism rates throughout the state. So you have a higher tax rate coming in, you have higher contributions to local economies, and you have less people long-term in prison, but also less costs when it comes to policing and the prosecution service for re-offending. So there are benefits to looking outside of the box to bring in new programs. And it's always controversial because people don't want to spend money on programs in prisons. They don't want to make it seem like prisoners are being rewarded. And it's definitely not a positive when it comes to election time. But if you look at the long-term benefits to the people of California, the mark is really being missed in terms of opportunity to, instead of incarcerate for life, you can bring people back into the community who can be beneficial in many ways. Given that, you also are not looking into the numbers when it comes to families going from two-parent families to one-parent families, or for those who are already one-parent families to children going into state care and that system. So you're not looking at the financial implications thereof. And when you reduce the parental influence in the home, of course, you are looking at generational crime and generational inmates. And that is something that if you talk to correction officers, they do see where it's generation after generation after generation that continues to be involved in the criminal justice system and incarcerated. So this could definitely look to decreasing those rates. Now, if you were also to offer supports and programs for single families that have a loved one incarcerated, you could also look at ways to intervene before the next generation of convicted individuals ends up within the prison system. Now, given the reduction of inmates due to COVID-19, you looked at a 21% decrease in the number of people incarcerated between February to October of 2020. That is 25,400. And that was down from originally 123,100 in February of 2020. Now, that alone brought in a $1 billion reduction of costs that they project will be reduced by 2025 due to the closing of 5 facilities. Now, the next question, is that going to cause more overcrowding in the state system, whereas 5 facilities are closed, the decreased number of inmates, but where is that really benefiting the communities? You are not increasing rehabilitation, you are not increasing support services, you are not increasing programs to intervene before people are involved in the criminal justice system. So it's logical to state that this is a short-term solution that could have dire effects long-term. And that, again, is something that has to be considered in the big picture. Now, as I stated, I had worked with youth gang intervention in Los Angeles. I've been in the inner cities of Watts, Compton, Crenshaw, Culver City. I've been all through those communities. I also have a godson who was raised in South Central, actually in Compton, and spent time there as well. Now, he is in openness here. He is serving life under the 3 strikes law for an unarmed robbery. So he was not armed, but he did rob someone. Because of his gang involvement previous in life, he was considered to be qualified under the 3 strikes law and was sentenced as such. Now, when you take into effect his family and his kids, where is that leading them? Well, fortunately, they have an amazing mother who is a great role model for them and seems to be doing an amazing job raising the kids to keep them out of that life. But again, when you look at the community, I mean, when I worked down there, people were, some youth were like 20 minutes from Santa Monica, and yet they'd never even been to the beach or the pier. And that was because both parents are working, or single parents were working 2-3 jobs just to make ends meet. And, the fear of youth going anywhere outside of their block, let alone their community, was just a very high risk for criminality by others. So they could very easily have become victims of crime themselves. And that is just a system that at the time I looked at it like corralling cattle. And you're bringing everybody in, you're locking them into this small area and pushing just an incredible amount of systemic, gross, racial failures that did not help to bring people up or to encourage them to lead a straight life. Instead, they looked for protection of the gangs. Take into that when you are, again, looking at the recruitment of gangs, whether it was back at that time or currently today, when there are immigration issues where people are coming to a new country for a new start and to explore the opportunities to really grow and care for their families in the future, You also have a risk of the predators in the gangs who are very good at identifying those at risk and those who they think they can prey on to join the gangs by having that friendship, that camaraderie, a place to belong, acceptance. I mean, these are all things that people strive for in normal day. But imagine how much more important that is when you are coming from a completely different country, a completely different culture. So the need for every individual, of course, is acceptance and to have a place where you feel like you fit and you matter. And of course, the gang recruiters really preyed on that. Now, this is still an issue in today's society, but we can do better and we should do better. So I think it's time to take a look at the 3 strikes law and really evaluate whether or not the long-term benefit is there for the community, or if it is a long-term benefit for those seeking vengeance or retaliation against those who prey on the communities. With that said, of course, we're not going to look at it as though we should, protect all criminals when they misbehave or when they commit offenses. But there should be some common sense instituted as to the benefits of true rehabilitation as opposed to just incarceration and warehousing people in violent and unhealthy environments. People refer to prisons as, as criminal education grounds or crime university and such, and that is a common theme not only in the U.S. but everywhere in the world, where they go into prison and they think they're learning better ways to commit crimes, and unfortunately the common sense that they're learning from the criminals who are caught eludes them at times. So this is something that also has to be corrected in terms of the influence inside the prisons if they were to be taught more life skills and actually I personally feel that if you are convicted of a crime and sentenced to prison, you should be forced to at least graduate high school, take courses inside as part of the system, so that people are more educated and have a bit more ability to find employment, to find a future outside of criminal activity. Many criminals are very crafty when it comes to finding ways of committing crimes or creating new ways. When they're in jail, they find ways to get things that they want. They can make tattoo guns out of an Xbox controller. They find ways to smuggle in contraband and so forth. Now imagine if there was a way to translate that to make them understand that if they have the skills and the thought process to come up with these concepts and these inventions, what they could really do in society and find ways to use that in a positive way. It could be life-changing for many people, but unfortunately, it's just not there. People are not reinstating or encouraging that they are possibly very influential inventors and creators. Instead, they're just looked down upon as convicts. So those are my thoughts and opinions on the subject. I hope that you will like, follow, and subscribe for more stories such as this and others from around the world. In addition, don't forget that you can also share this, and hopefully you will leave a message in the comments section. I always read them and look forward to receiving them. So again, this is James Cousineau in Vancouver, British Columbia with ProPix Canada Media. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.